Hey guys, it's Deen. This is not your typical retrospective. This is a historical recount of sorts. A story of wonder, a story of fates, a story of a man and a monkey. This is the story of when Deen met Donkey. The moment my eyes opened on this big old ball we call Earth, I was destined to share a home with a Super Nintendo. It wasn't a choice I made. It was a decree cast upon me. I don't know exactly which game was the first game I ever played, but I have random memories of my older siblings throwing a controller in my hand and letting me try out a few games. I'm not really good enough at editing to visualize the story the way I want, so I'm going to use Microsoft Paint to hopefully help you all envision this full picture. I grew up with a ton of siblings. No, like a ton of siblings. I always felt like there wasn't enough room for all of us in our house, and yet somehow, for as long as I could remember, we always had a game room. It wasn't anything fancy. I remember a CRT, a window to the right of it with a flower on the sill, and a poster to the left of it that, well, I can't artistically depict, so instead I'll just say it was a Mario mushroom. On the floor there was a Super Nintendo, and a little bit further out, a long 2-inch thick mattress that we'd sit on while gaming or watching Sailor Moon together. Weirdly enough, one of the earliest games I recall playing was Mario's Time Machine. I have no idea why my dad bought this game. My guess is he walked into the store and saw Mario and picked it up. But what I do know is we had absolutely no idea how to play or win this game. And despite owning it for as long as we did, I don't think anyone in my house actually beat a single level. But we did what any children would do in this scenario: we used our imagination. We'd go to that surfing section, one of us would be blindfolded and hold the controller, and the rest of us would scream out whether to turn right or left and see how long we could survive without falling into the whirlpools. Now I know what you're thinking. What does this have to do with Donkey Kong? Well, nothing, but it was one of the earliest game memories I have, and I had to squeeze it into one of my videos eventually. For now, let's go back to the 80s. On one hand, you have a company founded by two brothers in the UK that was really beginning to shine well into the early 90s, with Battletoads. On the other hand, you have a monstrous arcade title featuring a giant ape, a damsel in distress, and a tiny dude playing the hero. Over the course of the next, 13 or so years, these franchises and their respective developers flourished. Jumpman would move on to become the face of gaming, and Rare would release what felt like about 500 different Battletoad games. But as the 90s continued, and the 80s moved further away into memory, there was a new challenge. Would these two separate but equal paths continue to rest on their laurels? Was Battletoads going to be Rare's peak? Was Donkey Kong just going to get ported on every single device imaginable? Well, let's be real. You know it wasn't the peak for either of those companies. For as popular and as renowned their previous ventures were, the serendipitous nature of their marriage would ultimately lead to one of the most iconic games in all of history: Donkey Kong Country. I won't claim to be an expert on the way Rare, or even Nintendo for that matter, develops games, and I'm not trying to turn this into a video that involves regurgitation of Wikipedia. But the way I always saw it was that when Rare was looking for a way to both jump into the 2D platformer genre, and simultaneously improve upon everything that came before it, by simply focusing on the two biggest names that came before, you can find many attributes that were borrowed, and in some cases improved upon. Off the top of my head, you have an overworld, a rideable buddy, a companion that follows you along, collectibles, momentum-based speed, hidden bonus areas, and unique collectibles. And then, to top it off, you have the conversion of 3D models to 2D sprites that became famous through this game. It was glorious when it came out. You legitimately felt like you were a gorilla in the jungle. No mainstream video games had looked half as good as Donkey Kong Country did upon its release. And as a result, the game turned a lot of heads. And Nintendo leaned into the hype. For the first time since Mario jumped into the scene, they had faced stiff competition from Sega, and with Rare's new magnum opus, they were looking to take back their comfortable lead and destroy any chance of losing their grip on the industry. Everywhere you turned, you'd see the Kongs, every billboard, magazine, and commercial. All of it was there to tell everyone that Donkey Kong was back, and this time, he was the hero. Remember in my Sonic 3 video how I mentioned Ice Cap Zone was the first time I ever felt you could describe a stage's music as atmospheric? Well, Donkey Kong Country's music is probably the first full game soundtrack I could actually describe as atmospheric. Plenty of audio aficionados have covered it. There are literally videos hours and hours long that describe what exactly it is about Donkey Kong's music that makes it so great. I'm probably disrespecting composer David Wise by even taking a stab at it. But here goes. There are two aspects of this game's soundtrack that I absolutely adore. One of them is the fact that it feels like the music is interacting with the environment. Whether it's the sound of your Kong buddy banging away in a barrel, the chomping rhythm of a claptrap as he maneuvers, the sound of water dripping into the cave, all of those aspects fit in so perfectly with the overarching theme going on in the background. It's something I wholly appreciate because it almost gives you the sense of existing in the world you're playing. And it's a trope that future Rare games will successfully continue to use. The second aspect of the soundtrack that lights a fire in me every time is the way the music transitions as you, and in extension it, proceeds through the stage. You heard the title theme. Starts out with a calm and easy introduction, and then blasts into a beat so hyped you'd basically regret hitting the start button to skip. The music in the first stage takes over a minute to get to the climax portion of it, and when it gets there, you can't help but bob your head along and keep your eyes pierced for the next major swing. The theme in the cave sets this amazing atmosphere, and you think the sound is working perfectly with the environment, and it can't get any better, until you get to around the, 2.5 minute mark, and hear this. That amount of detail into a soundtrack is incredible. A fast player might not even get a chance to hear that portion of the song, so when it strikes you, it almost blindsides you. This happens all throughout the game. The soundtracks are perfectly synchronized with the environment and the game's aesthetics, yet somehow, just as you get sucked into the already perfect theme playing, a fire sparks in your ears and shoots straight into your heart, and the song just gets that much better. And this is in addition to all of the perfectly acceptable soundtracks in the bonus areas, the overworld, and even parts of the game where you're talking to another character. I meant it when I said I don't know how to properly analyze a soundtrack. This is literally my first time I'm even making an attempt to do so. And really, the first time I'm putting such an important focus on the soundtrack of a game. Because for the first time in my channel, this is a game that's infinitely made better because of the soundtrack, rather than it just being an iconic, memorable bonus. This is what it looks like to be a monkey in a jungle. In a cave, on a mountain, or even on a minecart. Or at least that's what it felt like when I was a kid. When I played games before Donkey Kong, I never actually felt like I was in those games. They just felt like they were fun little cartoony looking things that I loved. But with Donkey Kong, it's almost like a 4D experience. You're on those vines avoiding those bees. You're blasting out of those barrels. You're, jumping on a burning barrel of oil? Yeah. Because this game looks and feels real. The aesthetics were not only revolutionary because of their method of implementation, they were also exemplary of the implementation of a proper art style that could fit perfectly with what the game's objectives are. The sequels to this game might be objectively better as a whole, but I'm not sure if the atmosphere of those games are captured quite as well as this one's is. Every level, every Kremling, every set piece doesn't feel out of place. And there's somehow a sense of realism to a game about two monkeys that are on a mission to recapture their bananas from a bunch of lizards by jumping on their heads and blasting out of barrels. If that's not an accomplishment in game design, then I don't know what is. Donkey Kong Country is a linear game, but that's not a bad thing by any means. There's an overworld in place that isn't really as nuanced as, say, Mario Worlds, but it fits the standard of what was being dished out when the game released. 6 worlds, 40 levels. Jungle Hijinks does everything it can teach you about how the game plays. Whether you charge forward to try to use your roll to make a longer jump, take a high jump to unleash an item, use your roll to continue your momentum, there's a lot to unpack here that on a first time playthrough you might not master or even pick up right away. But with time you'll learn there's a bit of skill involved to controlling the characters. Diddy Kong might be faster and have a further jump, but Donkey Kong is larger and can kill a handful of enemies that Diddy couldn't handle easily. Rambi the Rhino will not only show you how absolutely game-breaking he can be, if utilized properly, he'll also help you find your first hidden room without you possibly even intending to. which is important because full completion of this game will require you to do quite a bit of exploration to find all of these bonus rooms. I might be jumping ahead a bit, but it is a fun little quest to find all of these rooms. I'm not really a fan of them and feel it could have been implemented better, and it was implemented better in later games actually. But regardless, it's a bonus and doesn't really make a significant difference to the game to actually go for full completion. Anyway, by the time you finish the first few stages, you should know all about the primary mechanics of this game. From rope climbing, to barrel blasting, to Kong letter collecting, to even wheel pushing. These are all tools used throughout the game that are objectives to get you to their next level. Heck, you'll even have your first water stage and probably feel the same sense of anxiety I used to feel in those levels because of how unforgiving they could be. Actually, the anxiety is probably down to the music and the aesthetics making you feel like you're deep in the ocean with the Kong brethren. That anxiety for me gets removed by riding On Guard though, so it's not all doom and gloom. World 1 is mostly jungle levels, with the introduction of the aforementioned water level and a cave level, which makes sense because it's called Congo Jungle. World 2, on the other hand, takes place in the Monkey Mines. Here you see your first walkway level and find Winky the Frog, who is just the happiest little fellow I've ever seen in my life. And oh yeah, he kills bumblebees. I love this guy. Then you have your first minecart level, which is hard as hell the first time you play it, but you eventually get used to it. Especially after you Google the secret shortcut that lets you skip. I remember as a kid, until I figured out the shortcut, I was stuck at this level for what felt like months. The final two themes introduced in World 2 are the ruins and the mineshaft, the latter of which used to literally give me nightmares because of these over-affectionate, freaky-looking monster zombies or whatever. Again, once I discovered the secret for this level, this game became a lot more pleasant for me. World 3 takes place in Vine Valley, which introduces you to the forests. Honestly, the aesthetic for this level is my favorite, and the sounds the birds make when you kill them is really satisfying because of how frustrating some moments can be. And then the treetops, which always reminded me of the canopies the Ewoks lived in Return of the Jedi. The rest of the tropes in this world are repeated from the previous ones, but the skill level required to beat those stages is a lot more apparent now. You'll find yourself dying more often than you'd expect if this is one of your first few playthroughs. Which isn't all that bad because one of the best things about this game are the animations when you die or lose or the game over screen. And likewise, all the little celebrations that occur when you beat a bonus stage or finish a level. Small little features like this make the game so much more enjoyable. But before I leave World 3, I want to talk about one main thing. Well, two. I forgot to mention the ostrich. He's cool, really fast, but not really my favorite animal buddy. He offers a half-decent glide, but it isn't all that. The other, and more important thing, is this guy right over here. The Lost Kong. Or orangutan, or whatever he is. In my headcanon, I used to think of this guy as the ultimate traitor. I mean, his name's Manky Kong. Manky Kong. This guy was clearly one of the boys. Somewhere along the line, he lost his way though. King K. Rool approached him and offered him Kong Island if he works for him and helps him screw over the family. And he did, because he was hungry for the power and was sick of DK getting all the praise. He was the one that allowed the bananas to get stolen and helped K. Rool succeed. He was the one that would have helped them escape if not for DK's and Diddy's heroics. He wanted to rule as the Emperor of the Banana Republic. He aimed too high, and as a result, he fell too hard. It was tragic. And it was all made up in my little 5-year-old head because apparently this is where I focused my brain power as a kid. I guess nothing's changed. World 4, Gorilla Glacier, finds you surrounded by snow levels that will obstruct your vision to ramp up the pressure on timing-sensitive barrel blasting sections, and ice levels that will see you slipping and sliding up and down the ropes to add a bit of challenge. I'd say World 4 is when the game takes the next step on the difficulty curve. You'll notice in all the stages going forward, and even the game's second minecart level, which has mechanics that are slightly different, but is still significantly harder than the first minecart level, because by now the game expects you to show a bit of mastery in its challenges, or to keep getting game overs until you can figure out how to get through some of the difficult challenges. But if you're in World 5, you'll get to the factories of Premcock Industries Incorporated. Some of the hardest underwater and walkway themes take place in this world, and the factory levels both offer a new aesthetic and some unique challenges that you might not really face anywhere else in the game. And the challenges will just continue to come at you in full swing in World 6 Chimp Caverns, with all of these final stages that genuinely feel like the end of a 2D platformer. And then, you finally make it. All the way to the King of the Kremlings, King K. Rool. It's very important for me to note that I think this boss battle is really good. It offers multiple phases, attack and defense sections, a sense of strategy you're forced to figure out as you play, and even a fun little gotcha moment that wasn't all that common in gaming at the time. The reason all of this is important for me to note is because all of the other previous battles that I glossed over kinda stunk. In fact, they're so weak in generic basic bosses that they're not really even worth discussing. But the King K. Rool fight? Dare I say it's better than the Bowser fight in Mario World? Or at the very least it rivals it. It's a great ending to the first game, and really makes this already awesome adventure end on a high. Well, unless you're going for full completion, in which case I hope you like speaking of Cranky, Funky, and Candy Kong, because you'll need to utilize the 3 of them to figure out where the bonus areas are. Or if you're playing in 2022, you're probably using save states and guides online, so maybe you won't spend as much time talking to them as I did as a kid. You might be surprised that I decided to play this SNES version of Donkey Kong Country for this review, given my preferences towards the GBA versions of the Mario titles. And well, that's because in the Mario titles, I didn't think you were really losing all that much in the drop of quality from the Super Nintendo to the Game Boy Advance version. In fact, I think there was significantly more to gain. And while the GBA ports of Donkey Kong Country have some great quality of life improvements when it came to storytelling, saving, going for full completion, and all the other stuff you'd come to expect in the mid-2000s that weren't really all that common in the mid-90s, the fundamental issue I have with the Game Boy Advance ports is the drop in audio and visual quality from the SNES version of these games. I still think the Game Boy Advance games are great options to play if you're going for full completion of these titles and have already played the Super Nintendo versions, but unlike the Mario series, if you're a first timer then you have to start with the Super Nintendo version, even if it means not going for full completion. The atmosphere of the first Donkey Kong Country game in particular rivals any other game from the 2D era, and maybe even a large portion of the 3D era up until the 2000s. The Game Boy Advance ports just don't do it justice in that regard. But regardless, whichever version you play, you're in for a great time. The common view during my lifetime was always that Donkey Kong Country 2 was the better game, and I'm fairly certain I abide by that point of view as well. But Donkey Kong Country 1 gets a lot of disrespect it doesn't deserve, primarily from people claiming it's too repetitive. Of the 40 stages, there are 4 jungles, 5 caves, 4 underwater, 5 walkways, 4 mineshaft, 2 ruins, 2 forests, 2 treetops, 2 snow, 1 ice cave, 2 factories, and 7 boss stages. And most of those levels, except maybe the first few jungle ones that literally introduce you to the mechanics of the game, are fairly spread out across the game and offer you different and unique challenges with difficulty spikes later on in the game, and contain tweaks to the aesthetics in multiple cases too. There were repeating themes in the sequel as well, and perhaps just as many quote-unquote dull, generic, and frustrating moments as you'd find in this title, or really any other AAA platformer from that generation. And there are a handful of people that make a case that Donkey Kong Country 1 is better than Donkey Kong Country 2, and again, I'm not sure if I'm one of them or not. But to hear defenders chalk it down to strictly being due to nostalgia and wholeheartedly disagreeing with their assessments, as if it's such an absurd and out there belief, is quite frankly disrespectful to everything Donkey Kong Country 1 accomplished. And I'm not even speaking from a nostalgia perspective, because I owned both DKC 1 and 2 as a child. I remember the day we bought DKC 2, and I'll share that story in the next video. Which, by the way, is available now on my Patreon, but otherwise will be out next week if you don't feel like supporting me. Which is totally fine. I'm just trying to figure out how to beat the YouTube algorithm, so at minimum a like and a subscribe would be much appreciated. But for now, let's go back to the mid-90s. I remember playing games as a kid before I turned 5. I already told you about Mario's Time Machine, a soccer game called Goal by Jellicoe that I'm way too nostalgic for. But all of those games were games that I didn't really know any better the first time I played them. I didn't put them into the console. I didn't choose to play them. I was just going with the crowd around me. My older brother was super protective of the Super Nintendo, and I was never allowed to play it by myself, so I didn't really have a choice. But around the age of 5, I'll never forget the day I walked into our game room unescorted, feeling like I was breaking a rule but convinced that I was old enough and mature enough to play a video game on my own. Moving over to our box of Super Nintendo game cartridges, and seeing a bunch of games I hadn't played before. I didn't realize it back then, but this would be my earliest memory of the first time I actually got to pick the game that I wanted to play. I don't even remember if I knew how to read, but what I did know is when I saw that big ape with that red tie, it was destined that I cherish this game for the rest of my life. As always, thanks for watching. Deen out.